I think everyone knows where they were when the casting was announced for Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights, and everyone found out that uh, Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie were going to play Catherine Ershaw and Heathcliff. Um, I remember being there, and I remember being incessantly mad. To be honest, I had read The Wuthering Heights. I read it when I was like a senior in high school for a Gothic literature essay I was writing. I read it at the same time as Jane Eyre, so I remembered very little, but just enough to know that that wasn't right. And I just remember sitting there and being like, "This is stupid." And so, in my pure bout of rage, I reread the book. I bought this at Half Price Books. Shout out to Half Price Books because I was not going to spend a lot of money for this. That being said, going into it, I think that we need to be having a discussion about why people are getting frustrated with casting. And it really needs to go back to the idea of we're doing fame casting again, which drives me incessantly mad. But to go into the specifics of Wuthering Heights and why it's so stupid, I want to go delve in deep to what is truly Wuthering Heights. What are we understanding about this? And what are some of the subplots that we're going into that mean for it not to make sense? And why I get so mad when everyone talks about Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie in their respective roles. Just a pure background, Wuthering Heights was made by Emily Bronte. She was born in 1818 and only lived till about 30 years. She actually died pretty close right after the production and creation of Wuthering Heights. She was born to a pastor's family and was in an abusive school for quite a part of her childhood before being sent back home and continuing her education there. She's well known for being antisocial. She was well known for not having a ton of friends outside of her family, and she cared more about animals than she did people, which, given the plot lines and people, how they act within her books, makes sense to me. That being said, Wuthering Heights was her big acclaim. It became a classic, and it was well distributed for its different types of motifs, such as dying, grief, and age. And then as we moved on further into its legacy as a classic, things like um, race and discussions of age also played into effect of it. Spoiler alert. This book is years and years and years old. This is thousands of years. No, hundreds of years old. But I will be the graceful person and say that this is a spoiler alert. Likewise, in this time, we also are introduced to Catherine. Catherine is noted as being young when Heathcliff first meets her. I believe he was around 13 and she was around at least 10 or 9. And from that, we see this kind of tale, their first part of their tale kind of unravel in about the span of, I would say, 10, maybe 10 years to about 13, which puts Catherine at a fairly young age. She is very young. And that's one of the big factors that you have to understand, especially when it comes to discussions of her and how her actions affect things. She is only at the earliest that she ends up having Kathy and then passing away about 21 years old, I'd say. That's at the latest scale. I also have her kind of marked as 20 or 19 when I was doing the math. Having that person that young be played by somebody who's older, considerably older, I think defeats the purpose. We have to understand that death was very common back in that time, and I think that it is a conversation that is constantly had in this book of learning to move on because you constantly are kind of bogged down by death. That being said, both of these factors are incredibly important to understanding these characters. Because he's noted as being dark skinned, it is imperative to understanding how the racial conversations and the racial undertones are described in the book and being present there, as well as understanding how because of Catherine's age, a lot of things need to be applied in that, and needing to understand and highlight how young she was, and that this wasn't just something that happened over the course of generations, but over the course of about 20 years, about 30 years, if I had to put my nose on it. And that is what we need to highlight within this book. Now, likewise with Catherine, we don't actually see her for the rest of the book. We actually see her only for the first part because she dies. She dies so young because of childbirth, and seemingly having um, a frail health, likely due to tuberculosis or something another that is very common in the Victorian age. Um, and she passes away. And so that's why I'm so confused as to why Margot Robbie is part of this cast, because there's other characters as well. Wuthering Heights was created in the, I'd say, mid uh, 1800s, and it is taking place, it's being described by our two unreliable narrators, Mr. Lockwood and Nellie Dean, who is going to be the generational nanny that the Airshaws had, and then, like, later wise, the Lintons had. We take place, and we need to understand why race plays such a role into this. We need to look at our main character, or at least one of our main characters, the one whom we follow the most, Heathcliff. Heathcliff is described on page 11 as being a G-word, or well, person of Romani descent. And he's described specifically as being dark-skinned. And we see this reinforced throughout the book with conversations of the Lintons and other people in which they describe him being dark-skinned, being somewhere from the coast where dark-skinned people are more common. Because of that, we need to understand that anything that was turned against him was often because of his race. We see that with conversations with Hindley, because they often got in conflict, and he would specifically talk about his race. All of these things came to a head in which, once Mr. Ayershaw, the head Ayershaw, the father Ayershaw, was passed away, and Hindley took over, he was cast aside. He stopped receiving his education. He stopped receiving his kindness that he received from the Ayershaw family. That being said, it is a heightened factor that he was specifically blamed most of the time in his childhood because of his race. And because of that, it creates a very defined factor of how we need to understand him. While I do not believe that Emily Bronte made this as a distinct conversation about race, I do think that at the end of the day, those topics do play into big effect and do create a conversation to be had around his character, especially as we move on when he's older. Now, to go further into Heathcliff's journey, we need to understand that he ran away after he found out that Catherine would have never married him. She acknowledged the fact that she would have never chosen him, even if she did love him, simply because he never had any of the background that she determined she needed to have a successful marriage. And because of that, he ran away. Now, he came back as a success. We don't know what that is. We don't know where he got that money. Nellie acknowledges that and often refers to him in a derogatory light as well. This is where I want to highlight Nellie as an unreliable narrator. We are getting this entire story from her, Nellie Dean, as this outsider. However, we do have to acknowledge that in that turn, she's unreliable because she's only there for what her thoughts are, her people are, and who the person she cares about. We need to acknowledge that for Catherine and for Heathcliff. Nellie never liked Heathcliff. She acknowledges this in the beginning of the book as well, where she kind of often refers to him as the problem child, the problem that's there. But that Catherine liked him, and so that's why she put up with him. That being said, she often also would talk about how cruel Catherine was, but also still loved her in turn, while she was simply just a child. I think in that aspect, we need to understand how Nellie chooses to do these things. And that's okay. Nellie has the right to have her own opinion, but we also need to highlight the fact that she has her own opinion. We're getting it from her voice and her voice basically alone. And that's the factor of it all. So while we see the book continue, Heathcliff becomes more and more vindictive, likely because he views himself as having to go against the people who've wronged him. And in turn, when you are blamed for something like your race being the problem in anything, I assume that you would also grow vindictive. And while Heathcliff has chosen to destroy every single family in his path because of the vindictiveness, and something that I cannot help blame, something that he does do, he becomes vengeful and vindictive, and he chooses to harm the people around him in the path to assure his um, ability to win rather than his ability to work on what was happening. And he never really atones until the end. When he passes away, he seems to have gone through a moment of atonement when it comes to Catherine's grave. But that was the only factor. We go into the second half of the book consists of Linton, Heathcliff, Heaton, or Heaton, um, Ayrshire, and then Kathy Linton, who is Catherine's daughter. Now, just for prefacing, Heaton is Henley and his wife's, I think her name's Francesca, son, and then Linton is Heathcliff and Isabel's son. Now, it is well acknowledged that all of this love triangle takes the predominance of this book in understanding what it means. They seem to fight over it. It seems to be a very bogged down thing. Now, that being said, the interesting part is that they're all first cousins. I understand this is the Victorian age. I just want to preface that. They are all cousins. They all know each other. They are all cousins, so I just want to preface that they're all first cousins. I definitely tripped up on me, but also I have to understand that they're like the only two lordships within that area, so of course the cousins are going to marry one another. Anyway, this love triangle becomes the interest of Heathcliff because Heathcliff wants to win the Lintons' money over. And he technically does by getting his son Linton and Kathy to forcefully marry one another during a extreme event. So they do, but Linton is a sickly child, so he actually passes away before Heathcliff ever kind of um, gets an heir out of it or anything. And so Linton dies, and then Kathy is now under the guardianship of her father-in-law, Heathcliff. The entire time that we're watching this, I think that it is an interesting factor of just understanding how problematic his life became afterwards because of how vengeful he was, because of how vindictive he was. But you can't help but understand the background of it, especially when it comes to race. Because of how much of his life and how much everyone viewed him as a villain because of his race, you can't help that he just kind of was like, screw it, I'll be the villain. And he did. He ended up becoming quite the villain in that aspect. And he chose to have those things. And I can't blame him on that. That being said, those discussions are quite the moment for everything, and how that prefaces the next part of the book and how we understand the casting as well. For all intents and purposes, we need to acknowledge that as much as Emily Bronte didn't make it about race, it is a defining factor of this book. That we need to understand how race politics actually play into it, especially when understanding complex characters like Heathcliff. Heathcliff was a villain at the very end of the book, but he never was the villain at the beginning. In fact, it was more of a circumstance type of thing that caused him to be the villain that he was. So that's what we need to acknowledge in that front. We need to acknowledge that he became a villain, but never was the villain to begin with. And that's why the race factor is so important, because he was unjustly blamed for a lot of things just because of his race, just because of who he was, that it was considered to look down upon when we do these factors. So, why do I get so annoyed with Jacob Elordi? Jacob Elordi is a white man. As much as we like to go, oh, well, he's a spicy white, whatever. Nonetheless, he's a white man. He's a white man who does not understand the vindictive struggles that Heathcliff goes through when understanding these books, especially since that it is a defining factor. We could have had many other races that could have played a character and understood the vindictive nature of Heathcliff, as well as showcasing the more important part of it, which is how it plays into effect of this book and this story. And because it is a justified subplot, we need to understand that we need to aspect that. And more importantly, what frustrates me more is that there were characters for Jacob Elordi to use outside of Heathcliff. He never had to be Heathcliff. And that's what I think was the more frustrating part for me, is that when rereading this book, he could have been Heaton Ayrshire. He could have been Heaton Ayrshire. Heaton Ayrshire was described as being a white man with dark features, dark eyes, and dark hair. Why wouldn't we do Jacob Elordi as that? Jacob Elordi would have still had the very complex issues. Heaton went through complex issues. He had an abusive father that neglected him, and then he had a vindictive guardianship that caused him to suffer in silence. He only really sees his happy ending until the last chapter of this book, where he learns how to read from Kathy Linton. He almost was the villain. The whole point of Hinton was talking about how he almost was the villain. He almost was the problem. He almost followed right in the footsteps of Heathcliff, but he never does. He finds his happy ever after in Kathy, and they are going to get married and move to the Grange and go somewhere else. And for me, it's like that person, the Foley of Heathcliff, is just as important as Heathcliff himself. And he was the Foley. He could have been the Foley and still fit a really well done character. And to stand there and act like Heathcliff had to be played by a white man because Emily Bronte wasn't thinking about white people, that's incorrect. That's so incorrect. Even if the complexities of race didn't exist at that time, or at least in Victorian area, was never discussed, she still made it the defining factor of noting him multiple times in this book as dark-skinned. Therefore, it is a subplot that is necessary to discuss and was delved in further as we move forward with the race discussions within society. Something that was a defining factor in noting this book. So yes, I am frustrated with the choices that were made. And that likewise, the same thing applies to Margot Robbie. Margot Robbie there's no reason for Margot Robbie to be as old as she is when the character was not that old. The character was 21 years old at the oldest. That's me erring on the side of precaution. 21 years old. And to stand there and act like she has to play the young person because that's the only role that can be filled is incorrect. Nellie is a defining factor. I think she could have been a great, unreliable narrator. Nellie is a defining factor in this book in understanding the complexities of these relationships. She explains everything from an outsider's point of view and is the person who is defining this. She's a constant character in this because it has to be. She has to be observant of every single person in this book. So why isn't she Nellie? Simply put, it's because they think that that's going to be the more defining factor. They're probably going to stray away from the book enough to where it's not really going to talk about the book at all. That's why I'm so frustrated, is because we need to be talking about this book. This book itself is actually quite good. That's why it's a classic. People read it and actually find it important to listen to and important to discuss. And why aren't we just doing that? Margot Robbie is a great actress. Jacob Elordi is a great actor. Do I believe they should have been in the roles that they weren't? No. In fact, the matter is, it's very obvious that the industry is turning towards fame casting. And anyone who's wondering what fame casting is, it just means that they're hiring big name people in cast just to have the fame of the name present for the film. And that's what it feels like for Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie. It feels like they added them as these two main characters, the two predominant characters, to make sure that they had their name attached to the film. When really that shouldn't be the case. We shouldn't be caring about that. We need to make sure that they're partaking in a character role that's going to make sense for them. And they had characters. That's the frustration, is they had characters that would have fit both of them, that weren't the character names that we had present in our future, or in their cast, really. That's why I'm frustrated. Is like, we could do so much more. We just aren't. We aren't looking at the books and going, what, I know I want to add these people. Who can I add them for? You're just giving them the biggest role because it's the biggest name. And I feel like we're straying towards that. I've been seeing a lot of casts that were changing things again that isn't valuable to us. And Wuthering Heights just happens to be like the defining factor of that, the biggest example currently, but nonetheless, a character nonetheless. And I can't help but feel that we need to reevaluate how we're casting again, because we've seen other casts like the Hunger Games also put out people and still be able to find people correctly to fit these roles. And that's what I really wanted, was to find people who correctly fit the roles, who would be able to do so. I truly believe that Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie would be able to put spins on these two characters that I presented as being better fits for them. They would be able to put spins on them that would make them more valuable to the cast or character, or even just themselves. Having Hinton and his complex feelings and everything, his anger that he doesn't know his misplaced anger that he doesn't know what to do with, would be great for Jacob Elordi. Having Margot Robbie as this kind of voice of reason, or this undoubtable narrator, to be present in almost, I would say, almost every single scene of the film, would have had her just as much present as any other part of the film. And that's what I think the frustration is over, is that itself. I want to have a good conversation with Margot Robbie. I want to have a good conversation with Jacob Elordi and seeing their presence in Wuthering Heights. I just don't think that we're doing it right. And that's the frustration. We could be doing it right. And so I just wanted to go on a rant about this because I felt like it was something that I could rant about. That's all. And for that, I just like talking about books, so you'll be hearing more from me. Bye!